Now, my mother. I could spend the next week on her. My mother, the family she's from, my grandfather, on my trainer, and his wife, that was talent. Immense amount of talent. An immense amount of IQ. And my mother was the strongest of all those personalities. And my father was quiet, very quiet, but just good looking but quiet. And she was just like a volcano, but gifted. And she knew that she could do about anything that needed to be done better than anybody else. And she knew that. And she could speak, she could sing, she could play the organ, she could sew, she could needlepoint, she could hook rugs. She was an incredible cook. She cooked to hired people, hired men, what we had on the farm. Later on, she could do everything. And when I think that the first 2 years, first and second grade, K Street, but then between my second grade and third grade that summer, we moved on the farm. My grandfather, the lease had run out when the man he was renting to, and he worked the deal out with my father and his older brother. 360 acres, I take a piece of the action. They worked it out. They were launched. And Snarr Brothers Enterprise came into existence. There were two homes. One was a cabin. They called it the cabin. Another was the nice home. Well, my dad's older brother, he had 3 children. My dad at that time had 2. So he got the bigger house. We got the cabin. There was no running water, and so the bathroom was an outhouse, but the same thing was true with the bigger house. They had an outhouse. I was amazed. Our outhouse was what was called a one-holer, only one hole. But their outhouse had 2 holes. I could not figure how come that place is 2 holes. You're not going to have 2 people getting in there at the same time. How can this be? 2 holes. Or ours was 1 hole. But just one of those things. Pretty hard to get in the middle of winter. Get out there in that cold and that snow in eastern Idaho. And you just got to go to that one-holer. There's no way around it. I mean, that's with number 2. But number 1, you can always halfway go and then come back. But not with number 2. You got to go there, regardless of the temperature. So there was something about that. You don't have time to put your shoes on. I got to run out there with my bare feet and go to that one-holer outhouse. But, so it was. But the hardest part was no plumbing. And remember we had this milk can, and they fill it full of water, and then we only had one dipper. And we all would drink out of the same dipper. And we hang it up on the handle. So everyone used the same dipper. Oh, brother. And here we are now. We have these plastic red cups that we drink, throw them away, and new one each time. It's amazing. But my mother, one stove. It was a coal stove. Had to cook on it. Would heat the whole place. Well, that meant that there was only 3 rooms. There was actually 2 bedrooms and then a kitchen area, and that's where all the action took place. We actually had a refrigerator eventually, and we had a little radio on top of the refrigerator. And we'd play it here, listen to all these stories and all these shows. And I always liked Red Skelton better than Bob Hope. And I mean, it was wonderful. The Shadow, remember The Shadow was one. There was all these different stories. It's amazing for the imagination. You could just picture it in your mind. We'd all be gathered around at night listening to that radio. But my mother personality was domineering. It was strong. And consequently, I remember her saying, I have taught Sunday school for 14 years and I've never once read a lesson or read part of a lesson to my class. I go prepared. If I want to read anything, I memorize it. Her memorization skills were unmatched. She was an incredible speaker. And when she spoke, she just literally mesmerized people. She just had that talent. But on the other hand, it wasn't easy. It really wasn't easy. And because, there wasn't much breathing space. Now, my aunt, who was home right next door, we're only talking just a few yards, and in between was a little small kind of a pasturage where there'd be cows and that would expand, and then there was a orchard. It was fantastic. We made our own apple cider, and it was quite a wonderful time. But I'd go over there to my aunt for breakfast afterwards. And I'd go in there and, oh, Dougie, come on in and sit down now. What do you want? I want pancake. And my mother makes these big, thick pancakes like this. But yours are just little tiny things round like this, and they're flat, and they're easy, and they're buckwheats. I like these buckwheat pancakes. These other ones are what she calls these buttermilk pancakes. I don't like those. Maybe it's the syrup. She uses this white Carol syrup. I don't like Carol syrup. Now you use log cabin syrup. It's a maple syrup. I like the maple syrup. I like what you cook better than what my mother cooks for breakfast. And so she would always, I'd get a double dose of breakfast. And I don't know why it is, but that's kind of the way it was. But Mother, because she was so strong, the radio station only had 2 radio stations. And the one you could call in and ask questions or answer and all this and that. It was quite known. Annabelle, Snarr hasn't called today. Because she usually would call every day. She was opinionated. She was well-read. I mean, really well-read. When my father died, she says, I'm going to go on a mission. And she went on a mission here to Salt Lake City. Now, during the time that he died to when she died, which was about 15 years, she'd read over 350 books. Now, these books, she kept a list of the name of each book, and I don't mean just books. I'm talking about the works of Shakespeare, it goes on and on. Just serious books she would read. I remember that I sent her the American history by Paul Johnson, which I think Paul Johnson is the world's greatest living historian today. And that book, what Paul Johnson, an Englishman, wrote, he received from President Bush the American Medal, a Presidential Medal of Freedom, went to Paul Johnson. I had read an article on the book. I got it. I couldn't believe it. This is a history that I could trust. I would start some of these history books, and they were so slanted, I said, I'm not going to waste my time. I'm going to read Paul Johnson. 1,000 pages. I sent the book to her. She read it twice. Now, at that book, when I finished reading it, I said, I got to call him. I got him on the phone. It took 2 days to get Paul Johnson on the phone. I said, Mr. Johnson, I have read your book, The History of the American People. It's the greatest history that I have ever read. He said, because America's history is the greatest history of all time. You could tell he loved America, the American people, and American history. And I was intrigued by what he said about the Mormons. It wasn't very much, but it was so refreshing. It was complimentary, you know. It was true. It was not exaggeration or anything else. It wasn't a lot, but it was true. And then we usually get slapped in the face one way or the other. Well, Paul Johnson's still alive. I subscribe to Forbes magazine because he writes one page, one article, once a month. I want those articles, what he has read. Paul Johnson's Modern Times. I remember Alan Porter telling me when he was the president of the 70s, he said, when I got a hold of Modern Times by Paul Johnson, I could not set that book down. Modern Times is the history of the 20th century. My mother was into all these kinds of things, these books. She wasn't afraid to read. She wanted to learn. She was hungry to learn. And consequently, there's few people she could talk to because the other people, farm people, didn't read. Now, one thing happened is that these wives would come and want to talk to her about this and talk to her about that. She says, these women are just soft daubs. I never forget her saying that. They're soft daubs. I'll never forget the time in going to church. You know how kids will talk and everything. And especially when they're passing the sacrament, afterwards they'll get together and they'll be talking. My mother would walk up. If I talked, she'd grab me by the ear, and she'd pull me right out of church in front of everybody. And out into the hall I'd go. And you're not coming back until you learn to keep your mouth shut, Doug. I remember Bill Nixon telling me, he remembers the time that he pulled him out of a sacrament meeting because he was talking. So there's no give. That's the way she was. At her funeral, the bishop got up afterwards. He said, I was a deacon. I was sitting right over there on the right side of this very room. And he said, I was talking to my cousin. And he said, Annabelle Snarr, after the first speaker got up, and she's right in the middle, walked to the aisle, walked on up the stairs, went to the podium, addressed the audience, and said, if you two Landon boys will shut up, maybe we might get something out of this meeting. That's what he said at her funeral. And she walked right back down the stairs and went back to her seat. She was very impatient. If a mother had children and they're crying, they don't have enough common sense to get up and take their children out into the hall so the rest of the people can hear the meeting and enjoy it. More than once, she would stand and point at that mother and say, Sister so-and-so, don't you think it's to everyone's benefit for you to take your child out into the hall so that you can understand and appreciate the meeting? but particularly so can all of us, because there's more of us than there happens to be of you. That was her. Was she popular? Well, she was respected. I wouldn't call her popular. So she was critical. But nevertheless, she was usually right. It's a nail on the head. But my father ran the show. When it came down to it, what he said is what they did, because there was no budge with him. And she would go along with him. But when I think about that cabin and getting up in these winter mornings, my father would get up and he would go to the barn to do the chores, to milk the cows, and Mother would get up and have to start that fire, and it was freezing cold. There was no foundation. It was built right on the ground. That cabin. Start that fire. And we finally, us kids would get out, my brother and I, and we'd get around that fire and that stove. And I think about what I got here with central heating. I can't tell you what central heating means to me. I just want you to know that those that have this tape or this DVD, the power and the strength that we all possess, and that it's inculcated within us, that fundamentally, when it's within our pale of what we can do, we can do it. We can do it by ourselves. And so, as Stevenson wrote, oh, the world is so full of many things. I'm sure we should all be as happy as kings.